The nations that had staged successful Marxist revolutions didn't do it on purely economic grounds, but first had attacked cultural institutions of the working class.
In this episode, I sit down with Liz Wheeler, author of the new book, Hide Your Children, exposing the Marxists behind the attack on America's kids.
Social emotional learning is one of the most interesting parts of how the Marxist ideology is reaching everyone's children.
What are the key ways in which Marxists take power? Why might the concept of neutrality actually be a trap?
We've fallen for this idea that we shouldn't insert any kind of values or moral order into our society.
This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Yanya Kellick. Liz Wheeler, such a pleasure to have you on American Thought Leaders.
Thank you for having me. It's my pleasure.
I've really enjoyed reading your book. And, it's kind of very provocatively titled. We're talking about, Marxists coming after kids. What is the reality of this situation? What do you mean when you say that?
Yeah, so the title of the book is Hide Your Children, Exposing the Marxists Behind the Attack on America's Kids. And this is the first question that people usually ask. They usually say, Liz, really? Marxists? Isn't that just an empty ad hominem that's hurled on cable news? Isn't that just the insult that we use that no one really understands what it means? And I say, listen, like many other parents during COVID, and I think this is true whether you're Democrat, Republican, conservative, liberal, we caught a glimpse of what our children were learning in school just by peeking over their shoulders during Zoom school. We saw that they were being brainwashed with critical race theory and transgender ideology, in addition to good old-fashioned moral relativism, that your truth and my truth is more important than the truth. And I thought to myself at the time, it seems like this is a concerted effort, series of attacks on our children. Why? Why is this happening all at once? And it turns out the answer to this is less of why and more who. Who is behind this? So what I realized is it's not particularly new. This is not something that just started happening during COVID. The left has, for nearly a century, attempted to re-engineer our society, and unfortunately, they've been pretty successful at it. They've captured what I call 4 out of the 5 major cultural institutions, our foundational institutions. They've captured the media. They've captured the education system. They've largely captured religious institutions. They've just about captured the law, and they've set their sights on the nuclear family, almost destroying that as well. You could argue that there's one element of the nuclear family left standing, children, which maybe explains why the left is going after these children. But what I do in my book is I name the names of the people and the organizations behind the capture of these institutions, behind the attacks on our children. And what I found is that the people behind these attacks are self-avowed Marxists or have embraced an obvious Marxist ideology. So that's the first half of the book, that I unpack the reality of what we're facing. I often say that if we as conservatives and Republicans refuse to acknowledge the reality of the political enemy that we face, even if it sounds hyperbolic when you say Marxist, if we refuse to acknowledge who these people are and what ideology they espouse, then we won't fight effectively against them, and therefore we won't win. What I do in the second half of the book is I offer a solution, and I will admit to you, it's different than what the Republican Party offers. I offer a solution for how we can reclaim our institutions and protect our children, both, of course, for the sakes of their individual souls, but also if we surrender our children to the left, our nation is done.
Our audience has grown quite a bit to basically have a whole bunch of different people under one umbrella. Of course, there's a lot of Republicans, we know that. Then there's a lot of people that call themselves politically homeless, right? And a lot of independents and so forth. So why the focus on Republicans?
It's a great question, and I think I can best describe this by saying that I first identify not as Republican, but as conservative. And as conservatives or as politically homeless, you can call us common sense people, you can call us independent thinkers, you can call us freedom-loving Americans. There's many ways to describe what we are before party affiliation. But the way that our political system works is you join one party or the other, whichever party you share the most values with, so that you can work towards a concerted goal. Even if you only agree with 7 out of 10 principles of the Republican Party, well, it's better than agreeing with 0 out of 10 of the Democrats. The reason I'm critiquing the Republican Party is because these attacks by Marxists, the capture of our institution, the fact that there are now targets on the backs of our children, is coming from the left. It's coming from far leftists. It's being embraced by the Democratic Party. Democratic politicians espouse this. And what we should expect is the Republican Party to push back on this. They should be fighting, you would hope, effectively to advance conservatism in our nation versus allowing this Marxism to seep into our culture and into our law. But they haven't. And they certainly haven't fought back with any effectiveness against it. One of the main goals of my book is to challenge Americans, regardless of your political affiliation. If you're sick of your children being attacked, if you recognize the chaotic reality that we are living in right now, where reality itself is under attack, then we have to ask ourselves, who is our most effective fighting partner? And if that effective fighting partner is the Republican Party, since the Democrats have embraced what I would describe as evil, we have to be part of holding the Republican Party accountable for how they're fighting.
Give me the landscape of what you see happening.
Yeah, so one of the debates that I think we've seen in this country over the course of the past even 6 months, not even going back as far as 2 or 3 years, but in the past 6 months, there's been this debate over what does the word woke mean? Can you define the word woke? And this has been asked to a lot of thought leaders, again, in the conservative movement, in the Republican Party, since we've embraced being the anti-woke party. And a lot of people can't define what it means. They recognize it when they see it. They know that white children being told that they're racist just because they're white, that's wokeness. Or a little girl saying, if you identify as a boy, you can be a boy. You are a boy. You are how you identify. They identify it as wokeness, but they can't really define what it is. So one of the things that I do in my book is I trace wokeness back to its origin. Where did it come from? What is it? How can we fight back against it if we don't understand what it is? And what I found is that it's the brainchild of a Brazilian Marxist named Paulo Freire. Paulo Freire had bananas views. He was a self-avowed Marxist. He did not believe in objective reality or objective truth. Therefore, when he looked at schools, the education system, he didn't believe that children were being taught knowledge, because he didn't believe that knowledge was a thing. He thought, well, every bit of quote-unquote knowledge is just the prevailing political narrative. It is not because it's right, it's not because it's true, it's just because it has emerged victorious in this competition of political narratives. And he argued that children shouldn't be taught the prevailing political narrative, that instead children should be taught to view the world through critical consciousness. Critical consciousness, of course, if you look into what is critical consciousness is essentially viewing the world through the lens of Marxism, where everything and everybody is either oppressed or an oppressor. It's the classic Marxist dialectic. And this critical consciousness, this viewing the world through a Marxist lens, is exactly what wokeness is. It is simply a rebranding or a redefinition of a word, a favorite Marxist tactic, a euphemism for this Marxist lens that is now being indoctrinated into our children in school. So when we understand that, when you see that, it's kind of hard to unsee it. And then we put that in a box for a second and think about, okay, Marxism. What is Marxism? A lot of people understand Marxism as economic Marxism. You think of Karl Marx, you think of the Communist Manifesto, and the simplest explanation is class warfare with the goal of communism, right? The working class revolting against the ruling class in order to have collective ownership of everything, private ownership of nothing. And honestly, that didn't work well. It was never it didn't spark a global revolution the way that Marx and Engels thought that it would, and it therefore died out. It was kind of relegated to just the crazies and the kooks in universities. It wasn't put into practice until a man by the name of Antonio Gramsci revived it and brought it back to life in the 20th century by recognizing that the nations that had staged successful Marxist revolutions didn't do it on purely economic grounds, but first had attacked the civil institutions, which is just another word for the cultural institutions of the working class. And so Gramsci proposed that in order for a nation to be transformed from what we would consider to be a free democratic nation into a Marxist or communist nation, first, before that revolution could happen, you have to destroy the cultural institutions on which the working class rely. And those cultural institutions that he named, among others, are the very same ones that we see modern American Marxists attacking in our society right now. The end goal of communism is the complete deprivation of basic human rights. It results in oppression, tyranny, and death. It depersons individuals in the countries in which communist dictators prevail. That is evil.
Well, it emphasizes group identity. That's one of the commonalities across all of these different, let's call them Marxist derivatives, right? Which you describe as wokeness. That's very interesting. Because of course I've had numerous guests on the show that are looking at this through different lenses as we try to understand it. I want to touch on the nuclear family for a moment. You said something interesting. I hadn't thought of it this way before, but you said the children are one part of the nuclear family that might not be compromised. What do you mean by that exactly?
Well, if you look at the traditional nuclear family, it's comprised of 5 elements: man, woman, marriage, sex, and children. Throughout human history, that's been the understanding of a nuclear family. And in our country for the past 150 years, I mean, this started pretty early in our country, there's been a concerted effort to destroy the family. Feminism, radical feminism, has told women that they're worth less, that they should copy men, that it's really destroyed parts of the nuclear family. The same with the attacks on men. That might be one of the most prevalent parts of our culture right now, this cultural attack on masculinity, telling men that testosterone is a toxin, that they're essentially rapists if they're not feminized out of it, that their desire to protect and provide for their families and their wives is somehow wrong and marginalizes their wives. It's culminated, of course, in the Me Too movement, where there's been a legal and social effort to deprive men of due process, of the presumption of innocence until proven guilty. It's the same with marriage. I mean, we have legalized gay marriage in our country right now, and I know this is a topic a lot of Republicans and conservatives are uncomfortable talking about. And you can even set aside homosexuality for a moment, or the idea that 2 people can do whatever they want in their own homes. Just set that aside for a minute. And the danger of allowing gay marriage to be legal lies in the ability of government officials to redefine words. Because whoever has the power to redefine words becomes the arbiter of truth. And the arbiter of truth, I mean, that's really just a nice way of describing authoritarianism. So when we surrendered marriage to justices on the Supreme Court to redefine a word that simply cannot be redefined, the institution of marriage existed long before we did, long before our country did. We surrendered a key part of our freedom. Of course, we also had the sexual revolution that tried to twist and pervert sex, that has really all these different elements. I mean, it's kind of a heavy thing to go through all of these assaults, because all of these aspects of the nuclear family have, at one point or another, been the target of Marxists, not just leftists, not just Democrats, but of Marxists. And the remaining element is children. The left needs to compromise children because they understand that in a simple debate, Marxism is not going to win over capitalism. If there was an honest one-to-one, here's what communism has to offer, here's what capitalism has to offer, communism's never going to win. So what they have to do is they have to separate children from their parents. They have to distort children's minds. They have to pervert reality by redefining words in order to compromise these children, so that these children, before they are fully intellectually, psychologically, and spiritually formed, can be coerced, is maybe the word, indoctrinated is maybe the word, into being permanent neo-Marxist revolutionaries for the Marxist cause.
You know, I noticed that one of your chapters focuses a bit on this social emotional learning.
Yeah.
Kind of, I've heard it described as a Trojan horse of sorts. So maybe tell me about that.
Yeah, the social emotional learning is one of the most interesting parts of how the Marxist ideology is reaching everyone's children. And an interesting conversation I had with my husband right after our daughter was born, our daughter's 2.5 now, was about you know, how are we going to educate her? Are we going to send her to private school, public school, homeschool? I mean, every new parent thinks about this. And I'm, of course, a proponent of homeschooling. I was homeschooled myself. I think it's great. My husband went to public school and he was like, oh, that woke stuff isn't in the public school in our neighborhood. Like, she'll be fine there. You just walk down and talk to the teacher. This conversation that we had has stuck with me because this is a very common, or it has been a very common thing that parents have thought that, oh yeah, the wokeness is out there. It might be in California, it might be in New York, but it's not in our neighborhood. It's not in my child's classroom. Slowly, the eyes of parents across the country have been opened to realize that this is touching your child, even in the public school that you went to as when you were a kid, that the classroom with the same teacher that's been there for 10 years, like, it's in there. And the reason that this wokeness has pervaded is through things like social emotional learning. What is social emotional learning? It sounds fine. The words are innocuous. They don't have any negative connotations. And it's not a subject matter. It's not like history and science. It's disguised as values education, which again, sounds fine. We want our children to be taught values. We want them to be taught right from wrong. But the question that parents should ask, and that I recognized when I wrote this chapter, is what are these values? If this is values education, what values are inherent? What it is an aspect of a worldview that is being packaged with every other topic. So you no longer have math. You have math with social emotional learning. You no longer have science. You have science with social emotional learning. You no longer even have gym class. You have gym class with social emotional learning. And what it is, this values education, is critical consciousness. It's Paulo Freire's critical consciousness, this lens through which they are trying to teach children to view everything from math problems to family interactions to how you behave towards other people. And the worldview that they are teaching children is a Marxist worldview.
So I want to talk about Paulo Freire for a little bit, because I've only somewhat recently, let's say within the last year, realized how incredibly influential he was. So he's, you know, I think he's the most cited academic on education in the American system by a margin. And somehow this has been baked into the education of every teacher and every teacher's college in the country that I'm aware of. Maybe there's a few exceptions, but how did that happen?
He once said something, Paulo Freire did, that I laughingly confess that I agree with. He said, there's no such thing as a neutral education. And at first when you hear that, you think, oh, indoctrination, that's bad. And the more that I thought about that, I realized he's right. There is no such thing as neutrality. Neutrality is an idea that Republicans have fallen for. We've fallen for this idea that we shouldn't insert any kind of values or moral order into our society, that we shouldn't use government, just authority of government, to help create this moral order. And because of that, we've withdrawn our values from a lot of these institutions that have been captured. And of course, what's happened is, since there's no such thing as neutrality, the Democrats have simply stepped into that void that we left for them and have hijacked that institution for their own purpose. And the way that I think is best to illustrate this is public education in our country was not mandatory until it became mandatory in 1852 in the state of Massachusetts, which a lot of people think, oh, that's not that long ago. And the reason that public education became mandatory in Massachusetts was because at the time there were a lot of immigrants coming to America, a lot of immigrants who were Catholics who were coming to America, and the Protestant politicians at the time wanted to make sure that the children who had been born in other countries, that was their homeland, coming here to the United States, were given an American civics education, because they would be the next generation of Americans, and the politicians at the time wanted children to be loyal to America if they were going to be American, versus loyal first to their homeland. So they made public education mandatory so that they could indoctrinate children in American values and also in Protestant values, because the politicians at the time were Protestants and they were anti-Catholic. As a Catholic, I laugh about this now, but this reminds us that the idea of indoctrination is actually morally neutral. Indoctrination, we think, oh, the left is indoctrinating our children, and that's wrong because of what they're indoctrinating our children with, not because they are indoctrinating our children. Indoctrination, the morality of indoctrination is completely determined on what it is that's being indoctrinated. Public education was created to be an indoctrination system. People on the right understood that at the time, but then we surrendered that institution that we had built for indoctrination to someone else. We surrendered it to the left in this false name of neutrality, in this false name of maybe separation of church and state, a misunderstood topic.
Well, I think what people would say, or what I might say, and what I've heard others say, well, yes, there's indoctrination, and then there's teaching of critical thinking. So indoctrination, the way I think it's typically used, the suggestion is that you teach someone the specific, correct way to view certain things, as opposed to teaching them the tools to be able to figure things out. So you're saying indoctrination is the passing on of a particular moral position. This is what I'm trying to understand.
I've used the term critical thinking my entire life because when I was in school, when I was homeschooled, I always felt that one of the things that set my education apart from my public school counterparts was I was able to critically think about things, whereas some of them were not. But in the course of writing this book, I realized that that phrase was a phrase that I should not have been using, because critical thinking is a Paulo Freirean phrase. It is describing thinking only through critical theory, not the way that you and I would think, oh, are we analyzing this exactly? What we're talking about when we say critical thinking is we're talking about independent thinking. We're talking about the ability to decipher a problem or not to be led by groupthink. But critical thinking is a misleading term that seeped into our culture that's actually quite wrong. And what I propose and challenge my fellow Americans, especially parents, especially conservatives and Republicans, is to understand that the idea that I'm discussing right now is not new. If you'll allow me to tell this anecdote, this is something that I've changed my mind on. About 7-8 years ago, back in 2016, I spoke at CPAC. And after I spoke, I was out in the lobby, and an independent journalist came up to me and says, "What do you believe the role of government is in America? How would you define liberty?" And this was like a very philosophical question. And I gave a very libertarian response. I said, oh, the role is to protect life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and otherwise, to stay out of our business. Unless someone's inherent, inalienable right is violated, government should really stay out of our business. And this independent journalist says to me, he says, well, do you believe that in the legalization of drugs? And I was kind of caught off guard. I said, what kind of drugs are you talking about? Like hard drugs? And it turns out, yes, he was. He was talking about meth. He was talking about heroin. He was talking about fentanyl. He was talking about cocaine. And I said, well, no, I don't think we should legalize those drugs. That would be self-destructive. That would lead to a chaotic society. And he responds by saying, well, isn't that a contradiction of your definition of liberty? And I realized that, yes, it is a contradiction. It turns out he wasn't a journalist. He was a cannabis legalization activist, which I suppose is neither here nor there for the purpose of this story. But this has stuck with me because, in a sense, he was right. This idea that freedom is the ultimate end, or that the definition of liberty is as close to absolute liberty as we can possibly achieve, is the wrong definition of liberty. And I challenge people to grapple with this. I know it's a mind-bending question, but to grapple with this question of whether freedom is the ultimate end or whether it is the means to something greater. We know that grown men dressed as sexualized versions of female strippers gyrating in front of children we all know in our guts that that's grotesque, it's immoral, it's awful, it's evil. If freedom is the ultimate end in and of itself, then there'd have to be some inherent morality to that. But there's not. Which led me to this evolution of how I think about liberty. It must then mean that freedom, if it's not the ultimate end, is the means to something greater. So what is that something greater? And it turns out that the framers of our Constitution actually grappled with the same question. This is not something that I invented. This is not a unique problem that I've thought about. James Madison, author of our Constitution, in the Federalist number 51, he defines the word liberty. He defines it in a way that matches freedom as the means to something greater. And he says that something greater is justice. Which I have read that Federalist Paper 51 dozens of times. But suddenly, as I'm writing this book and researching, I'm understanding it in a completely different way, because I recognized what James Madison was saying. When he said justice, I thought, oh, this is the debate between the John Lockean view on liberty and the Edmund Burkean view on liberty. And Edmund Burke, who was hugely influential over James Madison, Edmund Burke proposed that the definition of justice then, because of course we'd say, okay, great, the definition of liberty is justice. What's justice? The definition of justice mirrors original justice, capital O, capital J. And what he's talking about is natural law. So I realized that this moral order that freedom is the tool to achieve cannot be fully achieved or understood in our nation until we as a society understand that objective truth exists, that the definition of words like man and woman and marriage and moral and immoral, right and wrong, truth and liberty and justice, all of these definitions, which right now are up for grabs in our country, the definition of these words exist in the Judeo-Christian morals on which our Constitution was founded. And the response that I often get to this point is, well, are you talking about forcing a Christian nation? Are you talking about a theocracy? Are you talking about religion? And my answer to that is no, I'm not talking about a theocracy. And yes, I am talking about religion. Because you don't have to be a practicing Christian. You don't have to worship Jesus Christ in order to acknowledge that when our founders created the structure of government that was to guide and form our society, they did so by acknowledging the definitions of these words, and the definitions of those words were rooted, the origin was rooted in those biblical principles or those Judeo-Christian values. So my challenge to conservatives is we must re-embrace the idea of natural law, of these objective truths, if we are to reclaim our society from this chaos.